Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Ipshita Chanda and I teach comparative literature at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. This paper is on the new literatures in English, and we are going to consider minority discourses in this particular module. We want to see how minority discourses transform into new literatures or how new literatures contribute to minority discourses. So the aims and objectives of this module are, firstly, to clarify the idea of minority, especially in the Indian context, as a background to understanding the contribution of minority writers. For this, we will be reading in detail English writings by writers belonging to minority groups to show how they have tried to articulate their concerns against, within, and outside the mainstream discourses of dominant groups in society. The writings of these writers also explore their existential condition of marginalization and suppression by the dominant group in the society in which they live. To begin with, we will consider the material on the website of the Government of India's Minorities Commission, which defines the minorities and also shows how the Constitution makes provision for minorities. Now, though the Constitution of India does not exactly define the word minority, it refers to minorities and speaks of these minorities as groups based on religion or language. And the Constitution spells out the rights of minorities in detail. Now, these rights are divided into two parts. One belongs to the common domain and the other to the separate domain. The rights that belong to the common domain come under the fundamental rights, and they are available to all. But under the separate domain, there are special rights which are governed by Part 4 of the Constitution, which is known as the Directive Principles of State Policy. These are called directive principles because they are supposed to direct the government in the policies that they make. And Article 37 says that they are fundamental in the governance of the country, and it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. Now, what are the rights of the minority? Different parts of the Indian Constitution spell out these rights. For example, in Article 32, we see that the state is obliged, I quote, to endeavor to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities, and opportunities amongst individuals and groups of people residing in different areas or engaged in different vocations. Article 46 says that the state is obliged to promote with special care the economic and educational interests of the weaker sections of the people, besides the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. Now, language, education, and culture are aspects around which the idea of the minority is framed in the Indian Constitution. And several parts of the Constitution directly address language, education, and culture of the minorities. For example, Article 29 talks about the right of any section of citizens to conserve its distinct language, script, or culture. It goes on in Clause 2 of Article 29 to say that there is restriction on denial of admission to any citizen to any educational institution maintained or aided by the state on grounds only of religion, race, caste, language, or any of these. It also talks in Article 31, Clause 1, of the right of all religious and linguistic minorities to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. Article 30 also gives the freedom of minority managed educational institutions from discrimination in the matter of receiving aid from the state. Article 347 is a special provision relating to the language spoken by a section of the population of any state, which means that if the majority of the people speak one language, then a minority of a different language in that state has the right to form and administer schools in that language. Provision for facilities of instruction in mother tongue at the primary stage is given by Article 350A, and Article 350B gives the provision for a special officer for linguistic minorities and enumerates his duties. This makes the term minority relative to location and to the majority group in that location. So the idea of the minority is not an absolute abstraction. The assumption that minority refers to a particular religious community alone is mistaken and has led to both extreme antipathy towards the group as well as an erasure of differences between the many minority groups that inhabit the plural society of India. The artistic, literary, and intellectual creative activities of the minority writers have alerted us to the experience of discrimination faced by those fewer in number, and they have focused on how they have been deprived and marginalized by the dominant or the majority community. The rights of the minorities are directly related to democracy and the plural society of India. Now, religious, linguistic, or social groups which have fewer members have been discriminated against by the group with the strength of numbers. So, since democracy is assumed to be the rule of the people, by the people, and for the people, the domination of a small section, that is the minority, by the larger section, that is the majority, is undemocratic because it deprives the smaller section of the people of their rights. The Constitution of India, therefore, attempts to protect the rights of all, since it upholds democracy and thus makes multiculturalism and pluralism an inherent part of the social, political, and cultural fabric of our country. The making and implementation of laws, however, is not enough to ensure substantive equality amongst diverse classes, castes, and cultures. Discrimination has existed in Indian society due to social hierarchies. The division of population along religious lines at the time of independence rendered a particular religious group a minority in India, since partition was meant to separate the two religions into separate states. Hence, we have formed the mistaken idea that minority refers only to this religious group. In the introduction to this module, we have tried to dispel that mistake and to understand the idea of minorities in a holistic and relational fashion. We have tried to avoid the homogenization of difference amongst minority groups, the homogenization of difference between minority groups, and focused particularly on the stigmatization of homogenized minority groups. In the West, race and religion play a role in making the non-white migrants and diasporic communities as minorities. Besides, the incidence of slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean also create a section of people who are weaker than the majority. So they may also be called minorities in a certain sense. However, the social pluralism of India, as fortified by the unique constitutional concept of secularism, raises the need for the protection and development of all sorts of weaker sections of the Indian citizenry. This is what we read on the website of the Minorities Commission of India. The website goes on to say, whether this weakness is based on numbers or on social, economic, or educational status of any particular group, the Constitution speaks of religious and linguistic minorities, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and backward classes, and makes or leaves room for making for them special provisions of various nature and varying import directed by the directive principles of state policy. Now we will talk about representation of minorities. And representation, as we have seen in earlier modules, means the way in which minority identity is projected in the public imagination. Representation is a constitution of the other from the vantage point of a position that is taken to be that of the subject, which represents the other as opposite to herself. As we have seen in the model on literature and otherness, the minority is negatively defined with respect to the majority, and this deliberate construction is made to seem natural by ascribing opposite values to the subject who stands in the majority position and to the other who is in the minority position. This distinction is thus made by hegemonic social forces with a view to othering the minorities. Another category that we may focus on for a moment is minor literature. Now, there is no direct connection between minor literature and minority literature, and that is the reason we want to clarify this difference at this stage. The rapprochement of three distinct categories of literature make up what we know as minor literature, which is different from minority literature. These three different categories are: first, secondary literature, whether it be that of a minor nation or linguistic group in relation to a major tradition, or that of a humble minor movement, or the tendency within a larger tradition. The second category is marginal literature, or literature written by minority groups. And the final category, the third, is experimental literature, which, according to Deleuze and Guattari, minoritizes a major language. Bogue quotes Deleuze and Guattari on minor literature and says, I quote, "By treating Kafka as a minor writer, Deleuze and Guattari call attention to his status as a member of an ethnic minority, citizen of a minor region or proto-nation within a foreign-based empire, while insisting that his formal and thematic innovations in literature have direct social and political implications." Let us now consider the minority writers from the Indian subcontinent. The first person we look at is Humayun Kabir, who wrote both in Bengali and in English. Here we consider only his works in English. He was one of the co-drafters of the important UNESCO 1950 statement entitled The Race Question. Besides, Kabir wrote about Muslim politics in Bengal and a novel entitled Men and Rivers. Next we move on to I. Alan Seeley. Three of his works are mentioned here. The Trotter-Nama, which is set in the 18th century Lucknow, where the plural society of India, inhabited by not only the English but the French, who have come as mercenaries to colonial empires, the local people, and the various classes and castes who inhabit the city, exist in this novel side by side. Besides, Alan Seeley has also written a number of other novels, two of which we can remember: The Everest Hotel and The Brain Fever Bird. We next pass on to Cornelia Sorabji, who was a pioneer in the legal services in India. She petitioned the India Office as early as 1902 to provide for a female legal advisor to represent women and minors in provincial courts. In 1904, she was appointed the Lady Assistant to the Court of Wards of Bengal, and by 1907, due to the need for such representation, Sorabji was working in the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and Assam. Amongst her writings are Love and Life Behind the Parda, Indian Tales of the Great Ones, a collection of folk tales called Among Men and Women and Bird People, an account of Muslim women who lived in Parda called the Parda Nashin, memoirs of her parents entitled Bearfo, and a play called Gold Mohar, Time to Remember. Besides, Sorabji also collected a number of accounts of women by themselves which you can find on the net. You can see the URL given here. This collection of accounts is called Between the Twilights, being studies of Indian women by one of themselves. We now come to Ahmad Ali, who is justly famous for his novel Twilight in Delhi. In the novel, Ali depicts a vivid picture of traditional life of higher class Muslims in Delhi. The downfall of the Mughals and the decay of the hero Mir Nahal's family are parallel themes intertwined in the story, acting as allegory for each other. Ali also wrote a critical text on T.S. Eliot's poetry called Mr. Eliot's Penny World of Dreams. Besides, he translated the Holy Quran and the ghazals of Mirza Ghalib. He was also a playwright, and his plays are Break the Chains and The Land of Twilight. Next we come to the filmmaker and scriptwriter Khwaja Ahmed Abbas, who scripted 2 English films, Love in Goa and The Naxalites, which shows how and why the middle class and the poorer class of Indians belonging to different racial and religious backgrounds were joining the Naxalite movement. Abbas also wrote an autobiography called I Am Not an Island, and a realistic novel on the Indian freedom struggle called Inqilab. His autobiography narrates his adventurous life, his contribution to the national movement for gaining independence from British colonization, and his amiable relationship with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. Next we come to Nissim Ezekiel, one of the most famous poets of India, a member of the Indian Jewish community. His anthologies are The Exact Name, The Unfinished Man, and Hymns in Darkness. We could read from Nissim Ezekiel's minority poem. It's the language really separates whatever else is shared. On the other hand, everyone understands Mother Teresa. Her guests die visibly in her arms. It's not the mythology or the marriage customs that you need to know. It's the will to pass through the eye of a needle of self-forgetfulness. And you, uneasy orphan of their racial memories, merely polish up your alien techniques of observation while the city burns. Next we come to Keki Daruwala, another established and famous Indian poet who writes in English. Here we have a piece from his long poem, Migrations. Migrations are always difficult. Ask any drought, any plague. Ask the year 1947. Ask the chronicles themselves. If there had been no migrations, would there have been enough history to munch on? Going back in time is also tough. Ask anyone backtrekking to Sargodha or Jhelum or Miyawali, and they'll tell you. New faces among old brick. Politeness, sentiment, dripping from the lips of strangers. This is still your house, sir. And if you meditate on time that is no longer time, the past is frozen, it is stone. That which doesn't move and pulsate is not time. If you meditate on that scrap of time, the mood turns pensive, like the monsoons, gathering in the skies, but not breaking. Eunice de Souza is an Anglo-Indian poet of Portuguese ancestry. And here in this poem called De Souza Prabhu, she talks about this ancestry. No, she says, I'm not going to delve deep down and discover I'm really De Souza Prabhu, even if Prabhu was no fool and got the best of both worlds. Catholic Brahmin, I can hear his fat chuckle still. No matter that my name is Greek, my surname Portuguese, my language alien. I belong with the lame ducks. I heard it said my parents wanted a boy. I've done my best to qualify. I hid the bloodstains on my clothes and let my breasts sag. Words, the weapon to crucify. The novelist Bapsi Sidhwa also comes from the Parsi community, and amongst her novels are The Crow Eater, The Ice Candy Man, which was published as Cracking India in the US and India, and An American Brat. Her autobiographical pieces include City of Sin and Splendor and Why Do I Write? Asghar Ali Engineer was an essayist and commentator on contemporary work. His work centers on communal harmony and the rights of women in Islam, on Islamic theology and Marxism. A Living Faith, My Quest for Peace, Harmony and Social Change is a memoir of his life and testimony to his commitment to peace and amity between the communities. The poet Agha Shahid Ali grew up in a Kashmiri Muslim family. He moved to the United States of America to study and remained there. His anthologies of poetry are Call Me Ishmael Tonight, a book of ghazals, Rooms Are Never Finished, The Country Without a Post Office, and The Beloved Witness, selected poems. We will read from Agha Shahid Ali's Tonight. Where are you now? Who lies beneath your spell tonight? Whom else from rapture's road will you expel tonight? These fabrics of cashmere to make me beautiful, trinket to gem, me to adorn, how tell tonight? I beg for haven, prisons, let open your gates. A refugee from belief seeks a cell tonight. God's vintage loneliness has turned to vinegar. All the archangels, their wings frozen, fell tonight. Lord, cried out the idols, don't let us be broken. Only we can convert the infidel tonight. Agha Shahid Ali also introduced the ghazal, a traditional form of poetry originally composed in Urdu, to English-American audiences. Imtiaz Dharkar is an eminent Pakistani-born British poet, artist and documentary filmmaker. She was awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for English poetry. She has written 6 anthologies of poetry: Parda, Postcards from God, I Speak of the Devil, The Terrorist at My Table, Leaving Fingerprints, and Over the Moon. She writes about home, liberty, voyages, geographical and cultural dislocation, pluralism, and gender politics. Parda and Other Poems is an anthology of poems which deals with the various aspects of a Muslim woman's life, where she experiences unfairness, suppression, and violence engineered through the culture of Parda. Firdaus Kanga is an Indian-born British novelist. He is mainly remembered for his semi-autobiographical novel, Trying to Grow, which narrates the experience of disability as well as the experience of being part of a cultural and linguistic minority. The novel talks about the destruction of the Persian Empire and the rise of the Islamic domain in Persia 1,000 years ago. Firdaus Kanga has made a documentary film called Double the Trouble, Twice the Fun, exploring the effects of disability in human sexual life. Taboo, another documentary presented by Kanga, explores religion and disability. For instance, the Hindu notions of karma, showing how religion can exclude and patronize people with disabilities. Samina Ali, an Indian settled in Britain, in her work Madras on Rainy Days, shows how an Indian-American Muslim girl, Laila's life is torn apart by the clash of identities. In conclusion, this module has focused on the literary texts of writers of the Indian subcontinent who belong to religious, cultural, and linguistic minorities. We have not taken into consideration here the writers belonging to the so-called weaker sections or professional and caste hierarchies, which have extensively been dealt with in other modules of this course. These writers have depicted how the minority communities are being marginalized and suppressed by the dominant groups in society. They also explore the contribution of minority writers to new writings. This module examines the important aspect of minority discourse, that is, the representation of the minority communities in the public domain, and how minority identity is projected in the imagination and in the public mind. I would encourage you to go to the website of the Minorities Commission of India to understand the actual position of minorities vis-a-vis our plural democracy, and use that as a background to read the e-texts that we have provided. Thank you.